Good evening and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Gina Ingerell. This is for subject WELF 511 and it's recorded on October 30, 2022. And the presentation is going to be Advocacy versus Law in Disability and Aged Care. So without further ado, we'll just find the right button. Right, advocacy. Let's start with advocacy. What is advocacy? Advocacy is defined as the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. This is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. There are three types of advocacy: self-advocacy, individual advocacy, and systems advocacy. What do we mean by law? Law in its simplest form, and with consideration to the purpose of this presentation, is a rule of conduct or action prescribed and formally recognised as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. Advocacy in aged care. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission defines advocacy as the process of standing alongside an individual and speaking out on their behalf in a way that represents the best interests of that person. Advocacy in disability. The Australian Federation of Disability Organisations define a disability advocacy as acting, speaking, or writing to promote, protect, and defend the human rights of people with a disability. For both aged care and disability, it's important to also note three broad types of advocate: informal advocate, formal advocate, and a legal advocate. Let's look at the informal advocate to start with. This might be a friend, a member of the family, or a person working for one of the collaborating agencies providing care or service to a user. An example of informal advocacy. This is Mrs. Bailey, by the way. She doesn't recognise that hat and she says they're not her glasses. Mrs. Bailey has been in residential care for 3 months. Her daughters and grandchildren notice that some of Mrs. Bailey's outfits she wears don't belong to her. Mrs. Bailey told her family she asked the support staff many times, but nothing ever changes. Mrs. Bailey's youngest daughter decides it's not okay for this to keep happening, nor does she feel it's okay for staff to simply take no notice of her mother's requests to have her own clothes and not someone else's. So she decides she will advocate on behalf of her mother by asking to speak to a more senior member of staff. Advocacy in aged care and disability. The formal advocacy. A formal advocate will be a staff member who is working for an organisation as an advocate. That's a paid advocate. There are many organisations in both disability and aged care who are funded by government to provide formal advocacy. In the aged care sector, there are agencies such as Older Persons Advocacy Network or Seniors' Rights Service. And there are more than those, but those are two examples. Disability advocacy agencies found on AFDO, which is the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, list a number of the funded organisations, which we'll take a brief look at right now. So here's AFDO, the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, which in itself is a peak body. It starts off on its listings here with disability advocacy organisations. What is a disability advocate? What is disability advocacy? It has a list of the national peak organisations, and then down a little bit further, it has a list of the state-by-state disability advocacy services for individuals. And you can get the phone numbers and email addresses, etc., state by state. And these organisations are funded by the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So, right, moving right along. Advocacy in aged care and disability. This is an example of formal advocacy. And you can see Gwyneth over here. We'll call her Gwyneth, shall we? She looks like a Gwyneth. Gwyneth is our formal advocate here. So the example is Janice is an aged care support worker in a residential care service for older people. She looks after a man with dementia by the name of Peter. The staff say, he's gone, don't waste your time talking to him, you can't understand what you're saying. Janice doesn't agree. She sees there are many times Peter is lucid and he's very aware of what's going on and what's being said. Janice asks the staff for a reassessment of Peter's conditions, as she notices in the file he hasn't been seen by a specialist for 2 years. The director of nursing said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Peter had no family, so Janice contacted the Aged Rights Service. So that's a formal advocate. Those people in the Aged Rights Service are paid to be advocates. The appointed advocate was able to act on Peter's behalf and ensure he was given the care and the assessment he deserved. So yay for Gwyneth over here. Advocacy in aged care, legal advocacy. There are a couple of types of legal advocacy. One, legal advocacy is when a professional advocate with legal experience helps a person with a legal issue. The advocate can help the person through the justice system and to understand their legal rights. They can also stand up for the person if they're being discriminated against, abused, or neglected. The second type, legal advocacy, can also help make changes to the law, so it works better for the people with the disabilities. What's an example of legal advocacy? Well, the Centre for Disability Law provides legal advocacy. The way they accomplish this is by providing free legal advice to people. So in essence, what they're doing is providing legal advocacy. Law in disability and aged care. So a bit more about law. Let's understand the definition of law. Remember on slide 5, we gave a definition of law in the context of this presentation. It's a rule of conduct or action prescribed and formally recognised as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. The laws are prescribed within something called legislation. The law is the action or conduct required, and the enforcement or authority to enforce this is in the legislation. This means simply the legislation has been passed by either a state or commonwealth, which is federal government, to make the law enforceable. Therefore, it will become unlawful not to follow the law set out in the legislation. Examples of some of the legislation that we see in disability and aged care. In disability, of course, we have the Disability Discrimination Act 1992. We have the NDIS Act 2013. We have Disability Inclusion Act and Regulation 2014. And we have Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission Act 1986. In aged care, we've got the Aged Care Act 1997, the Privacy Act 1988, and the Age Discrimination Act of 2004. So why am I banging on about all of this? Why am I giving you definitions? Why am I really, getting back to basics there? Trying to make a connection. So if I don't define these things, it can be sometimes difficult for people to understand the context in which we're talking, because these words can have context in other areas. Law and advocacy, the connection. Now that we have some understanding about law and some understanding about advocacy, can we all see the connection? We can advocate for people to have more cups of tea or to have a bunch of flowers on their bedside table every day. These things are all nice and they're reasonable. But more often than not, advocacy will be related to the care and support that is not meeting the requirements or standards as set out in, wait for it, the legislation, or a set of quality and safety standards which will draw from that legislation or legislations. It's not uncommon to have a set of quality and safety standards which is drawing from 20 different legislations. So an act or legislation can contain laws that dictate how care and support must be delivered. However, this alone does not make it so. Services need to be held to account. Many service operators will go willingly, others go kicking and screaming, and some will be given many chances to abide by the requirements, but will eventually be sanctioned or have their privilege to deliver a service taken away from them. So, coming back to improving the skills of people with our practitioners and our professionals, who needs to improve their skills? Practitioners and professionals is what this question's about. And the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a practitioner as a person actively engaged in an art, discipline, or profession, especially medicine, and a professional as one that engages in a pursuit or activity professionally. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll think of a practitioner as anyone with a qualification which requires the person to be a current member of a professional body to be able to practice. And we will think of a professional as anyone who works in aged or disability in a paid capacity. What needs improving? Gwyneth is not happy. She's just not happy that she can't wing it anymore. What is it that's expected of her? What do we want her to do differently? Well, which skills need to be improved is the big question. As a professional consultant, auditor, mother, person with a lived experience, I see the biggest issue as this. You can't advocate for the right thing if you don't know what the right thing is in the first place. And I see that all too often. It's important that people understand the law, the regulations, and the instruments embedded in those laws. And I can tell you that most of the NDIS operators and staff that I meet haven't a clue. They've never read their policy in the first place, let alone having any idea what the quality and safety standards say. So how do we know there is a skill deficit? Well, who says skills need improving? Why do they think skills need improving? Is it the poor outcomes that are implying that the practitioners and professionals don't have a satisfactory level of skill in advocacy? Is it the level of complaints, the level of human rights breaches, the level of reportable incidences that's occurring within the aged care sector and the disability sector? Why do we need to improve advocacy skills? This is how we know in aged care services, for a start. The Aged Care Royal Commission final report recommendations has a strong focus on advocacy, some which are provide advocacy and complaint mechanisms for people receiving aged care. Now, this is already in Standard 6 of the quality and safety standards in aged care. So it bemuses me that we're still having to do this. That's why putting it in a legislation is not a fix. It'll help, but it's not the fix. Provide funding dedicated to improving individualised advocacy services for younger people who are living in or at risk of entering residential aged care. The new Act should set out the roles of advocacy services, the quality regulator and the Inspector General within the complaint handling section of the Act. That's fabulous. There'll be so few people reading that Act. Mainly, it's going to be interpreted into the quality and safety standards and be read by people in high places. And that's about all. That's about all. Additional funding for training and education in advocacy for all approved providers. And that's great. It's really wonderful that there's going to be some funding for education in advocacy for all approved providers. I still don't see it as the answer. This is how we know in disability services. The Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with a Disability interim report talks about a number of emerging themes presenting as pertinent to supporting the rights of people with a disability to live a life free from violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. And one of the themes being advocacy and representation. So yet again, I mean, we haven't got the final report yet. So advocacy has a strong presence again. So how can we improve advocacy skills? Clearly, Clearly, advocacy is going to assist, but how we're going to improve those advocacy skills. The aim of advocacy, according to Anne Jones, is to resolve injustices, not just make injustices tolerable, bring about change at the level of the individual, the service provider, and the system. And we talked a little bit about that before when we described the types of advocacy: individual, self, and systems. It's like many things I've seen over the last 15 years of quality auditing, such as managers coming to me because someone isn't doing their job. I first ask them if the person has a job description. The answer is usually, in those cases, no, they don't. There isn't a need for redefining advocacy. Advocacy is very well defined. It's the understanding of advocacy that the key players have, which could be letting down the entire team. And I've got the wrong way, go back and read it, because my experience is people don't read things. They don't know their policies, they don't know their quality and safety standards, and they most certainly don't know the act that they're working under. So what I did was I did a bit of a poll on my LinkedIn to see what my LinkedIn connections, which 95% are from disability, mental health, aged care, health, or, I've been in this area for all of my life. And I was limited. The LinkedIn poll potential answers are restricted to 30 characters. Therefore, I wasn't able to do a poll that I would have liked. So what I had to do was shorten them down. So the question: how can we improve advocacy skills in aging and disability practitioners and professionals? I gave 4 options. Make a mandatory refresher in advocacy every year for anyone who works in aging and disability. Update all tertiary curriculums to include advocacy skills. Make advocacy mandatory at inductions. And my last one was, it goes deeper than advocacy skills. So as you can see from the results here, we got more people choosing it goes deeper than advocacy skill. But interestingly enough, as you can see, the person who chose make mandatory at induction was an executive at the NDIA. And also interesting is that update all tertiary curriculums, and hang on to this because it'll become clear why I'm pointing this out. Update all tertiary curriculums. That was 2 RNs actually chose that one. And mandatory refresher every year. School teachers, a school teacher, and a service coordinator with the NDIS and home care. So I thought that was really rather interesting. So moving over to the next slide. Nurses have always been known as the patient's advocate. Arnott, Pallades, and Cruikshank. It's interesting that the 2 nurses chose embedded in the curriculum. I wonder how embedding the notion of advocacy is in other study areas. I can certainly confirm on my first day of nursing school, we were told as nurses, we are an advocate for a patient and their families if required. I'm certainly not advocating for this option, this choice in my poll. I, like the majority of the respondents, do believe that improving skills might go deeper than just band-aiding the problem, with those other 3 options, which I think were all 3 good options, but I don't think one alone was going to solve it. I do believe improving skills goes deeper, and it would be interesting to explore the most voted for option with a mix of open text answer fields and some predefined selections as well, because sometimes the predefined selections will prompt people who can't think at that moment. So I actually think I will follow through on that because I'd like to know myself. So in closing, the Royal Commission into Aged Care final recommendations is lathered with advocacy recommendations. Lathered. Unfortunately, this will not translate as a guaranteed fix, even if they throw money at it. For example, advocacy is already embedded in Standard 6 of the Aged Care Quality Standards. The Commission already had the power and it didn't work. The way forward to improving the advocacy skills of practitioners and professionals might be to conduct some research in relation to, one, why advocacy is not as robust as they would like it, and two, how best to address the answers to one. And so my answer to what would we do to improve the skills is I think we need to know a little bit more about it. I think that the answers that came up with in the Commission's recommendation, the Royal Commission's recommendations, were a little bit too quick, and people are just trying to wrap the present and put a bow on it as quickly as they can. I think we need more information, and I'm sure that there are solid reasons why advocacy is not being done. I think it really comes back to also you can't advocate for something that if you don't know what it is. And my experience is that the majority of people now in NDIS do not have a clue what it's meant to be. Therefore, how can they advocate for what it's meant to be if they don't know? And the same could be said for home care, because we have a lot of providers who do not need experience. They can hire somebody to write their applications. A little bit harder in the residential aged care facility area, but to get through a application process in that way. But yeah, so thank you so much for listening.